Wonderful.
So okay then, can you provide a contents overview of your storytelling experience?
Whoa. So yes, I started storytelling sort of seriously. It kind of emerged out of doing theatre. So I was teaching English and I joined a theatre group. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old that I started doing drama. And then it was very much a storytelling kind of theatre group. It was very interactive with the audience sometimes. So I learned about storytelling from other actors. And then I started using more and more theatre techniques and storytelling techniques in my teaching. And then I suppose in 2003, I went professional as a storyteller. So then I was teaching part-time and part-time storytelling. And most of my storytelling work since 2003 has been in the field of English as a foreign language, so teaching English through storytelling, although not exclusively. So I also do storytelling for people who are families, for adult audiences who are not English as a second language learners, people with disabilities, lots of different community projects. But still, the majority of my storytelling is with people who are learning English as a second language, or with teachers who are teaching English as a foreign language.
Yes, thank you so much. And how did your interest in storytelling develop?
Well, I think I started to answer that question in my previous answer, but it was also, I mean, I loved stories from when I was very young. I remember reading Grimm's fairy tales and thinking it was really scary and exciting when I was a small child. My father used to make up stories when I was very, very young for me and my younger sister. I've got three sisters, but me and my younger sister shared a room and he would tell us a story at bedtime. But I think my interest really began, like I said, through theatre, and then starting to realize that this was a kind of, some people would say storytelling is separate from theatre. For me, it's a kind of one person theatre when it's performance storytelling. I think the key thing for me is storytelling is a very interactive form of performance, but I think storytelling is much more than performance. It's much more about sharing identity and culture.
Yes. Can you describe the various storytelling techniques you have learned and experimented with that have significantly improved your storytelling abilities?
Yeah, well, I think every storyteller has his or her own way, their own voice as a storyteller. So I would encourage everybody to develop their own particular style. Because I work in the field of language education, and also because I came into storytelling through theatre, I acknowledge that I have quite a theatrical style of storytelling. So I use a lot of theatre techniques or drama techniques in my storytelling. And that for me is very useful in the context of telling stories to language learners. However, I don't only use those techniques, because if I'm telling a very serious wisdom tale or a kind of parable story, then my way of delivering it might be less theatrical and more serious. But the techniques that I typically often use when I'm telling, fairy tales or folk tales, particularly for kids who are learning English, would be using a lot of mime, a lot of vocal expression, always speaking the character's words, finding the character's voice, expressing the character's emotions in the story, and playing a lot with voice. And also I like using sound. I like using percussive instruments. But that's secondary. I think the first thing for me is physicalization and playing with vocals, and maybe even more important than all of that is interaction with the audience, getting the kids and, well, not just kids, adults as well, but especially kids, to participate.
And what are some unique ways you found to incorporate these techniques into your stories to make them more engaging and memorable?
When you say unique, you mean something that only I do, that nobody else does?
No, not really, but I don't know, for you. Like uniquely for you.
I like experimenting. I like trying out new things. So, for example, I don't think they're unique necessarily, but for example, there's one story I tell where instead of telling it in the third person, I tell it in the second person. So I'm telling you did this and then you did that, and that's like it's kind of like experimenting with the form, or I mean, I like to innovate. I like to try things that I haven't done before because that keeps it fresh. Or, for example, earlier this evening, I recorded a story in a way that I've never told it before. It's a story I've told 100 times, but today I told it as if the baby in the story was an old man remembering when he was a baby, and the story from a different perspective. So I like just to play really and try different techniques.
Yeah, thank you. And how has your storytelling style evolved with practice, and how has this evolution influenced your student engagement?
Okay, well, I think so much changes with experience. So when I started out with storytelling, I used to spend more time writing. So I would write some key skeleton points from a story. I might, when I'm creating a rhyme within the story, I would write out the rhyme and edit it and re-edit it. And it took me much longer to learn a story. And as time has gone on, I've realized that the barriers fall away, because I believe that everyone can tell a story. I think a lot of what gets in the way for people are blocks that we don't believe we can. And I think with experience, you just learn how to do it more naturally. So these days I find that I learn stories much more quickly, much more easily. And sometimes I only have to hear a story told once if someone's telling it in an engaging way. And then my favorite way of learning a story is, for example, Gizem, if you were to tell me a story about, for example, Nasruddin, and I never heard this story before, what I would do is, if I like that story, I would say, Gizem, please could I tell that story back to you? And then I would say, and then when I finished, I would say, so tell me, what did I miss? What didn't feel right about the story? And then I would take that on board and develop it. But I love now learning stories much more from people that I meet. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and Zoom and online storytelling, these days I'm very fortunate to meet storytellers all over the world, and they're all sharing stories. And if there's a story that jumps out at me, I say, oh, Gizem, please, do you give me permission to retell that story, as long as I acknowledge you and I tell it with respect to your heritage? And if you agree, then this is how I learn stories, and it's my favorite way. So these days, I don't usually learn stories from texts. I learn stories from people. Am I answering the question you asked, or am I going off on a tangent?
No, that's so perfect. I'm loving it, honestly. And in your experience, which skills have been most critical in capturing and maintaining student engagement during storytelling?
Maintaining students' engagement. Now I remember. For me, it's about giving students a role in the storytelling. So whether that is joining in with a repeated refrain or rhyme or song, or whether it's asking students to guess what happens at the end, imagine a different ending, or whether it's to say, well, what would you have done in this? What would you do in this character's position? Or to say, well, what real life experience that you've had does this story make you think about? So making connections to students, that keeps them engaged. And it's about also choosing stories which are right for that time of life where the students are. So lots of stories which get students to question identity are stories that I think are really suitable for teenagers. It's finding the appropriate stories for where the students are in their lives, I think.
Yes, okay. So how do you approach the process of preparing a story to tell? And how does this preparation enhance the effectiveness of your storytelling?
I find it very difficult to practice and rehearse storytelling on my own. I often encourage people to try it, but for me personally, it's difficult to prepare a story on my own. So I have a very patient and supportive wife, and she's called Tammy. And every story that I learn, I say, Tammy, I've got this new story. Can I tell? She says, not now, but maybe 1 hour's time or when we're walking. And then I tell the story, and then I try the story a second time, and then she says, oh no, that's enough. So then I have to practice the story on my mother. And my mother, Beryl Heathfield, is 97 years old, and she is a really tough audience because she says, oh, that couldn't really happen. I say, yeah, Mum, it's a story with animals talking and magic. Of course it couldn't really happen. So she's a really critical audience. And then maybe my sons, who are now adults, but they don't live at home. But yeah, so I'm always finding people to practice the story on before I take it to a stage of performance or the classroom. Or, for example, sometimes with students, I do tell it when I'm still developing the story, because that's okay. In the classroom, they know me, and they will forgive me if I make a mistake. And it will take 20 tellings before that story is fully evolved. And even then, like I said before about telling a story I've told hundreds of times in a different way, to keep the story fresh, sometimes adding a new element or telling it from a different perspective is a healthy thing to do, I think.
And what are some strategies for maintaining student engagement and interest when telling a longer story?
A longer story. Most of the stories I tell are short. I tell stories typically which are between 3 minutes and 10 minutes long, and I call that a short story. When you say a long story, are you thinking a story that might go on for like 30 minutes or an hour or several hours?
Yeah, an hour maybe.
Yeah, I really don't have many stories that are really long, maybe because of the context in which I
Iglo was
tell.
long enough. Iglo, for example.
Aguilar is a
Not
longer
that
story.
long.
Aguilar is a longer story, yeah. But Aguilar isn't, when I'm telling stories to the English learners, they are rarely very high level adult learners. If I was teaching a higher level students who are adults and were really into storytelling, I might tell Aguilar, but it's not a story I typically tell in the English language classroom. So that story I developed for performance to UK adult audiences rather than thinking about it with students. I probably did tell it to students, but not very often. So longer stories would be more for performance with people who are confident in English.
Yes. And in your experience, how important is the choice of story in ensuring student engagement, and how do you go about selecting appropriate stories?
So I think I've already answered that to some extent. I think it's really essential. I mean, I can't tell a story just because I want to tell it. I have to imagine my audience there. I have to hear it through their ears. And that's why I can tell the same story 100 times without getting bored, because I know for them it's the first time they've heard it. So I'm keeping it fresh and alive for them. So that's the key, I think. And what was the second part of your question?
And how do you go about selecting the appropriate stories?
Okay, so yeah, I just have to think about. I mean, I have a large repertoire of stories, and from that repertoire, so very often I think, okay, I'm going to teach some 15-year-old teenagers in Germany, like I was last week. These teenagers are very confident in English. Let's have a look. And I look at my repertoire. I have a list that I keep on my laptop. I also sometimes print it out, and I will scan through and I will tick stories. I could tell that one. I could tell that one. I could tell that one. Very often I look at the heritages of the students. So, for example, if I find out that among the students I'm going to be working with, there are students in Germany who are of Turkish heritage, I might choose to tell a Turkish story. Oh, and the other students who are not of Turkish heritage, learning something about Turkish heritage, but also the students that are from Turkish heritage living in Germany. Oh, our heritage, our culture is being acknowledged. I feel more included. I feel that, you know, this becomes a multicultural classroom where different cultures are celebrated. And I think that's a big part of what I do as a storyteller, is inclusion, celebrating cultural diversity.
Yes, yeah. Can you talk about how you adapt your storytelling style based on the composition of your audience, like age, cultural background? You already answered that question,
Yeah.
but and how does this influence your listener engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think one other thing I could add to what I've already said is including other languages. Last week I did a webinar for German teachers online, which was or 2 weeks ago, which was all about mixed language storytelling. So telling a story between two languages, and then also looking at not just bilingual storytelling, but the storytelling in the plurilingual classroom, where many different languages are used as home languages by students in the room, and including that. So asking students to bring in stories that they've learned from their Arabic-speaking grandmother or their, Spanish-speaking mum, and a story that they've learned in that language, but now they're bringing it into the English classroom, but also including words or phrases from the original language. So we're sharing not just the culture, but also, I mean, a simple way is obviously including story openings in different languages. So when I start a story from Arabic heritage, I might tell the story "Kanya Makan Fikadim as a man," and everybody steps into that world of the Arabic speaking story. So I think that's a really lovely thing to do.
Yeah. And can you share an example of a story you told where you felt particularly effective at engaging your students? And what skills or techniques do you believe contributed to this success?
Okay. So, all right. I mean, that happens to me all the time. So just a couple of days ago, on Friday of last week, it was my last day of my trip to Germany. And I was working with these 15 and 16-year-old students. And I was teaching them a story that they could take away and tell to younger students. So I was training 15 and 16-year-olds to be storytellers so they could then tell stories in primary schools in the same German town. It was a project called Connecting Schools Through Storytelling. And I chose a story that you, Gizem, know extremely well because it's extremely popular in Turkey. And it's about when Nasruddin borrows the pan.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, "Can I borrow your big pan?" And then the neighbor gets a small pan inside the big pan. So I taught that story, and that was really effective because in the group there were two girls who were of Turkish heritage, and they really enjoyed that story. So it's a story that was very easy for them to learn and to tell, and it had a lot of humor in it. So everybody was laughing, and at the end they felt that, yes, this is a story we can easily share with younger students.
Yeah. And is there anything else you would like to add regarding effective storytelling or skill development?
There's so much there's so much I could add, but I think that's probably some of the key things that I want to say. One, I mean, basically, who would be listening to or reading this information?
This is for English language teachers as a second language.
So the main thing I would say to English language teachers is, yes, you can. Because so often to me, I run a workshop for teachers and they say, oh yes, but David, you're a professional storyteller. You do this, you do that. I'm learning English myself. I teach English, but I'm not perfect in English. How can I do this? It's much better if I play a video recording of you, David, telling the story. And I said, no, definitely 100% no. It's much better if your students are hearing you tell the story. And I always say, well, at the beginning, I had one story. And this is many years ago now, but I used to tell the same story to every class I taught. And that was for a couple of years. I only had one story. And then I thought, well, this is actually something I'd like to do a bit more. So I'll learn another story. So then for another few months, I only had 2 stories. And then I had 3. And suddenly I had 10. And then, wow, a few years later, I had 100. But at the beginning, you only have one story. And you just need to build up that confidence and that practice and that rehearsal. Everybody can do it. And we all know that storytelling, oral storytelling, is the oldest form of passing on knowledge of education. It's effective because it's memorable. Humans are storytelling beings, and therefore every teacher, if a teacher can't tell a story, they shouldn't be a teacher. But basically it's about removing obstacles and getting people to believe, yes, I can do this, and nobody's going to criticize me. It's just me telling a story. And rather than hiding behind a persona, we don't need to be a persona. We don't need to be a theater actor to be a storyteller. We just need to reveal our storytelling selves. And sometimes people take a long time to discover that. And sometimes it happens as soon as I begin, I realize it's something I can do. But I think every teacher has that potential.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, David.
Do you agree with me?
I'm sorry?
Do you agree on that point, that every teacher can be a storyteller?
Yeah, I totally agree, yes.
Okay, Sam, I know you're a storyteller as well. So I'm really looking forward to finding out more about you as a storyteller on the CREST course.
Yeah, I can't wait for the CREST course. I'm so excited about that too.
Fantastic.
It's so nice to meet you, David. Thank you for taking your time. And
well, you know, you managed to get a lot into a short time in that interview. Very
thank
good.
you so much.
Good questions, and you were very easy to talk to. You're very encouraging. So thank you very much, and good luck with your research. And may I wish the very best to you and to Turkish teachers and Turkish people generally at what has been and what continues to be a challenging time in your history.
Yeah. Thank you so much.